guys, Mac with the Outer Circle. When I did my review of the Hallett Mage Pro, I spoke a little bit in that video about the different features and quality of life improvements that people want to see in the hardware of 3D printers. Spoke a little bit about the software as well, but I wanted to then expand on that a little bit today because obviously get a reasonable amount of feedback from the games community and I want to make this freely available information to these companies if they want to court people who are making 3D printed miniatures. Because 3D printing market is in a bit of a weird place because we're creating one type of machine which is tailored to essentially all different aspects of printing, and they have different requirements. We are making the same printers for people who want to print themselves little engineering components for at home, which is the same printers that people are using to print things like fidget spinners, which are the same printers that are being used to print miniatures for wargaming, tabletop wargaming, which are the same printers being used to print vases and things like that. And the quality of the printers and the things that are required are just slightly different for each of those applications, and you could probably customize a machine very much in any one of those directions based upon what it is you're chasing. Well, for miniatures wargaming, I've been printing for, 5 years at least, like consistently, and I've owned, for example, I think my very first resin printer I personally owned was an Anycubic Photon, the original model. Tiny, took forever to print things, okay quality. It was a fantastic printer for the time. Obviously, I owned a Hallett 1, a Hallett Mage Pro currently. I've also got I've had a Creality LD006, a Hallett Plus, Hallett 1 Plus, Elegoo Saturn S. So it's not even all my printers, but I've owned a lot of printers and I've printed a lot of miniatures. In fact, I've printed an entire 30k army, which I haven't even shown yet. Some people have seen that project. I haven't revealed what legion it is or anything like that. I've printed a whole bunch of Lehman Russ chassis for Imperialis Militia. I've done a whole Marine Forces, as I mentioned earlier, Tyrannid models, Necron models, you name it, okay? BFG, lots and lots of stuff for miniatures wargaming, busts, such as a Demon Lilith for Diablo 4 back when they released the original trailer. Like, it was one of the first things I printed in my Hallett 1. So yeah, going back a bit. Anyway, I have a lot of experience with this sort of stuff, and I talk to my community, and I talk to my friends whose opinions I trust, who also do a ton of printing. One of these friends has over 30 printers himself. So again, we are people who are using these things all the time, and so I want to share our feedback. Because I have 12 items here. It was originally 11, but 11 was very weird, so I sort of forced a 12th item in there. And I have a chart. And I'm going to place these items on the chart and discuss the thoughts around it. So on the left side of the chart, we have the less desirable, okay? On the right side of the chart, we have the more desirable features. Then we have a high importance at the top and a low importance at the bottom. So the first thing we're going to look at here is screen resolution. So screen resolution is something that has kept creeping up and up and up in the last few years, and it's a major selling point for all these 3D printing brands. And here is the thing. It's pretty much as unimportant as it gets, because once you hit 8K resolution on a 10-inch approximate sized printing screen, you are not physically, with the human eye, going to be able to see the detail, let alone paint the detail, that any further increase in resolution will grant. In which case, every pixel above that 8K is pointless. There is a noticeable difference between 4K and 8K at 10 inches, but unless you're going over about 13, 14 inches, you are not going to notice an improvement in print quality with a 12K screen. So 3D print companies, from me, a person who has painted all of Forge World's Primarchs, who has won, many painting awards throughout his life. I'm not the top of painters, but I do well enough. Not important, okay? As someone who does paint the details, like the eyes and the pupils in the eyes, it is not important to have 12K resolution. If you're going to be spending resources on the tech, it shouldn't be spent there. It is a low priority, and it's not really that desirable. 8K will do. Alright, next up we have the VAT film. So this one here is a quality of life improvement, but not hugely important beyond that fact. So it's going to go over to the side here. VAT films puncture, they get damaged, they wear down over time, and not a huge amount seems to be being done in the space to make them hardier. I've seen a few different materials trialed, PETG, polyethylene, silicon. A few different materials have been tried, but something better has to exist for VAT films, something with a bit more longevity to it. And that's really all it comes down to, because changing these things is a bit of a pain, and they do flog out. So it's a quality of life fix more than anything. Alright, next up is high-speed printing. Now, high-speed printing is desirable, but moderately low priority. So I'm going to stick it around here on the chart. Yep, high-speed printing is fantastic if you need to print a lot of stuff. But if you're not printing very often and you have time up your sleeve and patience, well, who really cares? It's just neat to be able to have it, but it is not the be-all end-all of your printer. But if I had the choice between high speed or high resolution, I'm going to probably pick high speed because I do print an awful lot. And like I said, resolution, not that important. Next, download and slice. So this one I actually think is in the somewhat more important category. So I'm going to put it up around here. We're at the point where not everyone has a PC at home anymore. A lot of people just use tablets or other forms of technology, or they have a computer, but it's a work computer and they can't put their own software on there, such as proprietary slicing software for different companies. All these printers keep releasing with the tiniest little screens on the front of them. We're willing to put a 12K resolution screen into the top of the printer for printing the miniatures, but we're not willing to put more than a mobile phone from the 1990s screen in the front of the printer. Why? People want to be able to see the miniatures that they're going to print to make sure that everything looks correct in the file first and foremost. And they also want to see that, well, what they're picking is the correct file. So why is it being locked away behind these tiny little screens all the time? And like I said, people don't always have access to proprietary software and computers to work on, so why can't we build into these printers or have an optional purchasable additional screen that plugs into them where we can download the files to, slice the files and put them into the printer instead of having to walk around with USBs or using Wi-Fi or using cloud software, whatever it might be, to do all of this. Build it into the printer. If the printer gets 2 inches wider so that we can put this function into it, I don't think people are really going to care. But I've noticed a lot of feedback from people on the channel saying, how do I go about doing all this downloading and slicing? Where do I store the files? My computer's not very good at this, or I don't have a computer. How do I achieve this? It's important, and there are steps being taken. Like Creality has taken some steps in this field, and other manufacturers have, with providing like little proprietary sort of tablets, but build it into the printer. I think that's really the best way to go. A more powerful processor can easily handle this, and if you have a HDMI extension built into the computer, if you're already putting a 10-inch high-powered tablet into the front of it, sure, you can have a HDMI port that you can hook it up to a monitor or a TV to see even more. Next up, a very important one and desirable, so it's going to go up the top here. Air filtration. There are harmful polyepoxides that are coming out of these printers, and these things are bad for you. and people know it's bad for them. And especially for those who live in cities, have smaller dwellings, don't have an external shed like myself where they can put these things to run, they have to share a room with it. And they're sharing a room with a carcinogen, a toxic material, and if they have families, small kids, animals, they don't want them exposed to this stuff. So anything we can do to limit that exposure is important. And brands like Creality have them built in. Elegoo has their own proprietary air filter system, as do many other brands now. That's good to see, but the filters are still very, very small on many of them. A big step up was on that Hallett Mage Pro that I reviewed recently, where they have a hose which plugs onto the back of the filter cartridge, which you can actually run to the outside. So you can run it to a window or to an exhaust port, and it will vent the filter to the outside. I mean, it's still getting into the environment, which is not ideal, but it's better than inhaling it in a confined space. But filtration, very, very important. Speaking of important things, screen life. So again, we're trying to have these 12K high resolution screens, and yet half of these printers are only a couple of thousand hours in screen life before they're burned out. DLP is representing a significant advance in this area, looking at like 20,000 hours or so before burnout on the screen. So fantastic. It is very important and highly desirable to many people, so I'm going to put it up in this area here. But I think it goes without saying that people don't want to be having to replace electronics and pulling apart their printers. This is fine for the early stages of a technology or for the pure diehards of a technology, okay? It's like building a home PC. Yes, many of us have done it in our life, but a lot of people don't want to build their PC. They just want to buy something off the shelf. They don't want to have to think about it. They don't want to have to work on the PC. They don't want to be updating graphics cards and drivers and things like that, working on the hardware or the software. So the more plug and play and the easier you can make it for the layman, the more likely that the layman is to actually purchase the product in the first place. And right now, knowing that your screen is going to burn out after a given amount of time is a turn-off to many people. And I know this because people have told me this directly. It's anecdotal evidence, but it is evidence. Now, speaking again of quality of life things, but things that are less desirable because of noise or other reasons. So, Resin Pump. People don't want to handle resin. It is toxic. It often rashes people. I seem to have no reaction to it, but epoxides and polyamides, over time, these resins actually build up to toxic levels within your system, and you essentially become allergic to them where you weren't before. This is to grossly oversimplify what's happening. You therefore don't want to handle the stuff if you can avoid touching it. So every printer by now should have a way of plugging the resin into the printer and automatically filling and emptying the vat without you, the person who is utilizing it, to have to touch it. Now again, recent printer that I played with, the Hallett Mage Pro, that has a resin pump built in. Doesn't work very great. I had issues with it. Like, okay, it really just wants to empty very well with it, and it'll only fill up a very small, fine layer in the bottom of it because of the way it was designed. And some people have even snapped the little nozzle off by moving their build plate at the wrong time in their printer. That has happened. Mistakes happen on these things. But it was a step in the right direction, and more companies need to embrace it because no one wants to handle the stuff, and we shouldn't have to. If the technology has been around for long enough now that we're talking about, again, 12K screens, super high resolution, DLP, 20,000 hour print life, and yet we're not putting simple things in here like a resin pump. No, it needs to be added. And in the same vein as that, auto clean. Now, auto clean in this case, I'm not referring to cleaning the vat out. Okay, the resin pump can pull it out. What I'm referring to is a quality of life improvement, which realistically is probably going to become very important down the line. So it deserves a higher spot here, and it is desirable. And that is that there I can see a point where wash and cure machines, which are a separate device to 3D printers, essentially go the way of the dodo. At the moment, these devices are cumbersome. They're a whole separate unit unto themselves. They're filled with very nasty smelling fluids like isopropyl alcohol, methylated spirits, and other proprietary agents. And then obviously the resin that you're introducing into them off your miniatures that you've printed. And well, you've got to handle the miniatures in the first place, get them off the build plate, then you've got to pick them up, put them into the cleaning vat, clean the miniatures off, pull them out of the vat. They're going to be soaking in alcohol and such. Then you either leave the lid off and let it drain out, and then the room stinks of isopropyl alcohol. And it's a whole process. And when we're talking about quality of life improvements, down the line, and I'm not talking tomorrow, but in the next 5 years, I would like to see some sort of high pressure jet inside these printers, and this jet is able to spray high pressure cleaning agent onto the printed miniatures whilst they're still inside the printer and cleans it all down. Essentially, I want to turn 3D printers into a vending machine. You walk up, you hit go, on your nice big screen on the front of your printer, produces the miniature, and after it's produced the miniature, it cleans it all off for you, and when you open up the printer at the end of the entire job, there is a finished model on its building foundation, sitting there, clean, ready for you to touch with your bare hands. No touching of chemicals or cleaning or masks or anything like that required. Completely user-friendly. That is the stage we need to get to. And until we get there, this technology has a serious flaw, which is going to prevent people, basic users, who would like to 3D print from 3D printing and getting involved in this market. Next is AutoLeveling. So desirable, but not super important. It sits pretty close to the middle of it, to be honest. AutoLeveling has been introduced in things like the new Anycubic, I think M5 model, where it has a pressure sensor built in, so it can detect how much pressure or force it's applying to the screen, and it also senses how much suction pressure it has when withdrawing from the screen. Downside is early days of this technology, and if you're printing something very small, which has very little suction force, it thinks that, this print has failed because I'm not really using any force to pull the print head up. I must have failed as a print, and it cuts the process off. It stops printing. So those sort of quirks need to be worked out. I think a combination of using a laser which is able to scan the entire build plate, combined with pressure sensing technology, a multi-pronged approach will probably be the best solution to that. In the short term, a firmware update may just do it. Another surprisingly important thing, but not super desirable, vat heating. So a lot of these resins are really temperature sensitive. And if you live somewhere cold like I do, or people in Europe and America in certain months of the year, once you're hitting 0 degrees Celsius, you're getting to that negative Fahrenheit and such, all of those temperatures do not help with 3D printing. You really have to start playing with settings on your machine, longer exposure times, using higher quality resins that are more expensive, all the issues that come with it. Because the resin wants to be at 30-ish degrees of temperature, give or take. Higher the temperature, the faster the cure time. For those who are wondering, if you're using an epoxy resin, you're not in this case, but if you're using an epoxy resin, it doubles in curing speed for every 10 degrees of temperature Celsius that you induce into it, approximately. So temperature is very important for resins. It helps with forming those polymer chains and bonding them, which is what we're actually trying to do here. So built-in vat heating, again, it's one of those things that really should be in place already on more systems, because it's actually quite a simple principle. And well, so many of these companies, like Creality, perfect example, produce 3D filament printers already with heated beds. They already know how to put this technology into a printer, because the bed is heated up to 60 degrees plus on their base models of their printers. So if they were to introduce similar type of heating bed technology into their printers, it would really help with the quality of prints if you're living somewhere where it's getting into the negative degrees. Another very, very useful thing, very desirable, but really not a huge priority, is real-time monitoring. Webcams are incredibly cheap now, and not many manufacturers are putting them inside the printers. Why? This hardware, especially if you're buying in bulk, direct from supplier, somewhere like China, you can buy as cheap as, I think, $8 for a 1080p camera. If we had these cameras inside printers, you could pull it up on your phone, quickly go to the printing app, look it up, and hey, look, how's my print doing? And you can visually see it while you're not there. And oh, my print failed, cool. Go into the app on your phone, hit stop print, and your printer stops itself. That would be fantastic, and unfortunately, we're not really there yet. There are ways of sort of modding printers to make it happen. Some companies do have cameras in them, but it is not widespread. It's something that would just be lovely to have, but it is a low priority. And lastly, because I said I'd put 12 in here just for the sake of being even, it's not really important at all. It's desirable though. A hinged lid. There are still companies like Anycubic. They make good resin printers. I'll give them their due. Like I said, my first one I owned was an Anycubic. They don't put hinged lids on. So you're coming up, you've got your gloves on, and you open up the machine because you want to pull the print head out for your finished part that you've just made. So you're pulling out this part, and it's dripping resin off it still, and you might get it on your gloves or hands or whatever, and you need to, clean the part, take it off its build plate, off to the side. Meanwhile, the vat is now exposed to light, to ultraviolet light. It's exposed to air, it's exposed to dust particles and other contaminants. It's also bleeding off into the environment because not only is air passing particles into it, but it's also blowing microscopic particles of that polymer out of the vat. So you want to be able to put the lid back on, but you can't because your hands are covered in resin. I usually put sticky back adhesive handles onto all of my printers for this reason, but on something like that Hello Mage Pro, which is the picture I used here, so I guess free plug for Creality, that has a hinged lid on the printer. So I can just use my elbow to close the printer, and then ta-da, nothing is getting contaminated, nothing's being instantly exposed to ultraviolet light through the window in the room or anything like that, and it just is a big quality of life improvement. And yet we have Anycubic, like I said, fantastic printer manufacturer. But Anycubic has a lid that you have to lift on and off with your hands. You have to slide it over the top. And that's also a pain in the ass if you have a confined workspace. If you're working in, say, a shelving unit, for example, like I have, I've built a series of steel shelves, and if I was to use one of those Anycubic printers, because I need so much space to lift the top of it off, well, then I have to spread my shelves further apart, and I start wasting a lot of space in the room because I've got all this air that's just not being utilized above the printer that I have to leave space for the stupid lid to pull the thing on and off. It's just not ideal. So when you look at this chart now, and again, I discussed all of these concepts with people prior to putting this episode together, except for the hint lid thing, because I think it speaks for itself. And I think every one of these, vat heating, by the way, was brought up by that friend of mine I mentioned who has got about 30 printers. And he was right. It's dead right. It was very important. And I shouldn't have missed it. But have a look at how this graph sits manufacturers. So Anycubic, Elegoo, Creality, Sonic, Frozon, whoever. Look at the chart and look at screen resolution. It's the least bloody desirable thing, and then look at what the most desirable things are. Air filtration, screen life, automatic cleaning, resin pumps, vat film life. Okay, all of those things are occupying that important and desirable category. And download and slice is in that important and desirable category. So if you want to dominate your market, because it is a very stiff competition. I know it is. It has to be, because you're all doing the same things at the same time. You're all rushing to put out 12K resolution printers right now so that you're keeping up with the Joneses. Probably doesn't translate well across to Chinese, which many of these companies are, but essentially you're trying to keep up with one another. You're trying to follow trends in the market that your competitors are doing so you can market the same thing so you don't lose market share to people who are buying based off hype. Oh my god, that new printer is 12k res. Who cares that it's bloody 12k res? It's not actually important. And because it's not actually important, why are you focusing on it? To keep up with other printing companies? Do something genuinely useful and unique and market it well. If you bring out several of these things and you do it better than the competition in one package, and you don't rush the printer onto the market with a bunch of flaws, you will see success. If you say, hey, we got you a 20,000 hour screen life, your VAT film is going to last twice as long as regular VAT, you have an awesome built-in air filtration, it's not some thing that's smaller than a soft drink can, we're putting a unit in here that's enormous, you've got a resin pump which will auto-fill and empty it, you don't have to touch resin in this bad boy unless something's really gone wrong, and we've got AutoLeveling, we've got downloading and slicing built into the screen, has a VAT heater. If you bought all of this out in a printer and you'd made it sub $1,000 Australian at 10 inches screen resolution, it'd probably be hard to hit that price, but I think 1200 is more realistic. But if you did all that, you would become the next Ender 3. You would become the next Anycubic Photon. You would become the printer in the market that everyone goes to. But right now, you're all doing the same thing as one another, and all of the tech improvements are just these incremental little steps, and usually it just boils down to screen resolution. I mean, Creality, yep, a latest model. You've got high-speed printing, yes, and you've got a resin pump built in, yes, 2 big wins, and a great filtration system. So 3 wins, really. In fact, 2 of these things are right up the top there, but just sort of bungled the resin pump in the way that it fills and empties and can get snapped off by the print head, okay, and the way that sometimes when it lifts up, it pours resin down into the machine. Those were all things I picked on in my review. Big problems. But, you know, those were actual improvements in the machine. But I know Creality is going to push for a 12K machine because Anycubic did it. Anycubic, great, they put an auto level in there. Doesn't quite work right, but you know, it was something. And they've also, you know, picked up in speed as well, not Creality speed, but the speed. And of course, Anycubic has a massive user base and a good name in the resin printing market. And then there's Elegoo, which still insists on using ball mounts for all of their print heads. And look, guys, I like Elegoo's quality. I hate the ball joint. The build plate ball joint. And I spoke to a lot of friends about this who have used the same printers, and they agree. And for many of them, if they weren't already with that brand, and this is a big thing with 3D printers, once people find a brand they really like, and I admit I've kind of fallen into this too, once you find a brand you really like, you often tend to stick with them because you start to know the brand and know the product. And Elegoo got in pretty early into the market with the original Mars models. And then the Saturn, and they did it a little bit faster than the competition and really established themselves and then make a fantastic product. But why on earth are they using a ball joint when there are so many better systems available for mounting the print head? It's got me flummoxed. So until they fix that, I'm just, as a personal bias, not going to recommend Elegoo printers. Yeah. And those are sort of some of the ones I think of. But anyway, I'm Mac with the Outer Circle. Please, if you print a lot of miniatures on 3D printers, I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think that myself and the people I've spoken to got this wrong? Obviously, there are things that we would want to do with the resin, but the resin itself is an entirely different thing. There are certain physical traits we want to get out of that resin, which need to be spoken about, and that deserves really its own video, or at least a talking point that's separate to all of this. That's why it's not featured here. So don't talk about the resin. That will come later, but talk about the hardware. What is the highest priority for you? I'm willing to bet that for 90% of you, it's the same as me. And for the 10% that it's not, some of these will at least be the same. Anyway, that's it from me. I'm Mac with the Outer Circle. Thank you all for watching this episode, and I hope you all got something out of it. See you all next time.